Si nombreux pour accueillir notre conférencier Antonio Giustozzi. Alors, je vais parler en français et ensuite deux mots en anglais, dans un mauvais anglais, pour vous dire que nous sommes très heureux de l'avoir au nom de l'Université de la Sorbonne Nouvelle, au nom du programme ERTI que nous animons moi-même et Louis Tourny ici présent. Et je crois que nous avons probablement, je le dis pas seulement pour le flatter, mais aussi parce que je le pense, l'un des meilleurs experts sur l'Afghanistan, les talibans en particulier. Le livre de Taliban at War est réellement un chef-d'œuvre qui fait comprendre pourquoi cette guerre allait être perdue, qui montre très clairement l'existence de deux communautés, une communauté internationale autour des États-Unis, de l'Europe, des Nations Unies, et une autre communauté plus diverse, islamique, autour de l'Iran, l'Arabie Saoudite, le Qatar, qui aidaient de l'autre sens différents shura à l'intérieur des talibans. Et ici, notre conférencier Antonio Giustozzi travaille pour le moment dans un institut, le Royal Institute, qui est un des plus anciens institutions de recherche à Londres, si j'ai bien compris, qui a été très longtemps advisor for United Nations, with a lot of consultancy work in Afghanistan. And as I was saying in French, but I'm sure you understood, that your book was absolutely illuminating, your book about the Taliban at war. And I didn't have time enough to read in order to do this presentation, your last book, which is about the Islamic State in Khorasan. And it is something that we don't know about, that we rely on you for giving us a few clues about this organization. Why is it existing? What are its, let's say, the reasons for its existence? Is it growing? What are the differences with the Taliban? And so on. So we very much, we look forward to having some explanations, and we are very happy to have you. So the floor is yours, without further ado.
Thank you very much, and apologies for delivering this intervention in English, but my French is very rusty, so I think it's better for you if I speak English. And so I'm going to discuss a little bit, I will start from the history of the Islamic State in Khorasan, which today has become quite famous, but in these early days was mostly ignored, and it was mostly ignored and certainly understudied and misunderstood. So I think it's important to look at its origins and its early developments. And there was a big debate in 2014-15 in particular when it emerged. Many people didn't take it seriously at all. There was this idea that the Islamic State was essentially, in Khorasan, was a fake organization, that some disgruntled Taliban formed it just in order to have access to funding from the Caliphate. The Caliphate at the time, of course, was at the peak of its financial power. They had a lot of money. They were offering this money around the world to establish branches or provinces, as they called them. So the presumption was that these people were just opportunists who wanted the money. And there are also people believed that it was essentially a cosmetic operation set up by the Taliban themselves for a number of reasons. Now, of course, today we know that that was not the case, that the Islamic State in Khorasan was not a fake, something was definitely there. Nobody doubts that anymore today. And today, there are many people who believe that given the very deep crisis of the Caliphate, Khorasan is emerging as one of the, if not the branch, that has got the best chances of surviving or even overtaking, if you like, the central Islamic State in terms of importance, in terms of capacity. But anyway, to start from the beginning, how did it start? I think there's an element of truth that certainly many of the people who joined Many of the people who joined in the early days were opportunists, not necessarily in the sense that they were just there for the money, but were not aligned or fully aligned with the ideology of the Islamic State. Essentially, there were significant numbers of members of the Taliban and of the Pakistani Taliban, or DTP, who knew that something was moving in terms of negotiations. At the time, in 2014, for already a few years, there have been rumors, more than rumors, that the Taliban leadership was seeking some kind of political accommodation with the Americans. Al-Qaeda was aware, they had objected to it. The relation between Al-Qaeda and some elements of the Taliban and the political leadership was beginning to become a little bit more problematic. Groups like the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan and other groups close to Al-Qaeda were also objecting to these trends. So there was a climate that was conducive to some extent for some kind of split. Of course, the split was not possible until the resources became available, until somebody appeared, in this case the Islamic State, to offer the resources, sufficient resources for setting up a rival organization. So you had actually several groups that formed, not only one group of Pakistani Taliban, one group of Afghans and some Central Asian, but even among the Afghans there were actually 3 different groups from the very beginning, coming from different factions of Taliban, with different ideas, different leadership. Actually, we didn't like very much each other. So it was actually quite a disparate bunch of people. Not many of them at the beginning were Salafis. They were all, I would say, tendentially hardline jihadists, but not as hardline as Islamic State. There was no idea of takfirism, for example, at the stage. Many of these people were simply ideologically probably closer to the Muslim Brotherhood rather than to the Islamic State. But they wanted to separate from the Taliban, and they wanted an organization that would not approve of any peace negotiations. So in a sense, I describe this in my book as a kind of, if you like, military class, people who were born into the war, they grew through the war, through the wars, because Afghanistan had already had several wars at that point. So, when you start fighting when you're 14, there's no old life to go back to, right? So these were people who didn't see peace as something that would fit them. They knew that peace for them would be essentially the end of any prospects of a future, in a sense, of where it would be, at the very least, it would be a demotion for themselves. It would not have a future post-war. And they were all people, many of them were people who had been denied promotion within the Taliban or within the Pakistani Taliban or within the Central Asian groups. There were, of course, as always happens in any human organization, there was infighting, there was competition over appointments. Everybody, of course, wants to be a leader, but not everybody can be a leader or will be a leader. So there are many people who were denied promotion, whose rivals have been promoted in their place. So there were jealousies that separated them from some of the Taliban leaders, for example. But especially, this was very important for the Central Asian. But in those years, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan was disintegrating. Very serious rivalries emerged over the succession to the original leadership, and that contributed to drive many of them towards the Islamic State in Khorasan. So there is an element of truth. These people were not ideological sympathizers of the Islamic State. It's also true, though, that a certain number of them had been to Syria and Iraq. Some factions within the Taliban or within the TTP and some Central Asian, of course, relatively speaking, many more Central Asian had been to Syria and Iraq, so they had been directly exposed to the ideology of Al-Qaeda. So they were typically they joined Al-Qaeda, of course, not the Islamic State, which didn't exist at the beginning. But when the separation happened, like many of the foreign fighters, the majority of foreign fighters, of course, when Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State separated, joined the Islamic State. because of the new thing, it was they had a lot of resources, the money was with them, but also was seen as, a very successful enterprise, especially these very fast victories in Iraq projected this image of the Islamic State as an invincible organization with the immense resources, something that al-Qaeda would never be able to match. So in a sense, that's true. There were some Salafis from eastern Afghanistan already joining, but at that time, the presence of Salafi was not so prominent. In Afghanistan, Salafis is something new. Salafis appeared in the 70s in eastern Afghanistan, was imported from Pakistan, and started spreading and spread for many years, and especially during the war in the 1980s. And from there reached also northeastern Afghanistan, more recently started spreading elsewhere. But the Salafis in the early years were not opposed to the government in Kabul, to the government established by the Americans and by Western countries in Kabul. They had issues with the Taliban during the first emirate, so they were quite happy. Not they were happy about the Americans being there, but quite happy that the Taliban emirate had been overthrown. And many had actually taken refuge in Pakistan. They started going back to Afghanistan. So they're looking after their own business. They're trying to reestablish the community. The Taliban have closed their mosque and their madrasa, so they are busy trying to reorganize the community. Of course, ideologically, they would eventually start turning against the pro-American government in Kabul, but it happened at a later stage. So I think you could argue that there was an element of opportunism. Of course, it was not a Taliban set up to kind of deceive or try to pretend that Taliban, for example, some people argue the Taliban were set it up in order to pretend to be more moderate than they were, so they would be able to say, look, these are the real extremists. We are actually quite moderate after all, so you should negotiate with us. That was simply a conspiracy theory, basically. There was no truth in it. So that was the beginning. But, of course, at the beginning of 2015, these various groups that were emerging during the previous month came together, and the merger was definitely sponsored by the Caliphate. It was sponsored, endorsed. In fact, there was a lot of pressure from the Caliphate for them to unite in a single organization, and then the Caliphate announced the establishment of the province of Khorasan. And these groups filled this box. The province of Khorasan was an empty box, and these groups filled it. And in principle, they all united in a single organization. That was the announcement, that was the idea. It was not a reality at that stage, but that was what the Caliphate wanted and what the Caliphate expected. And it was not, the Caliphate, as it became clear over the years, was not just willing to tolerate this kind of games about opportunists joining and doing their own things, setting up their own kind of world organization, their own fiefdoms inside Afghanistan. They tried to do it, so you had that these various organizations described, a few more emerged later. In the end, they had 6 or 7 different groups between Afghans, Central Asian, Pakistanis which joined. Each one of them tried to actually maintain their separate identity within Khorasan. So they all, in principle, merged, but in practice, they had their own leaders, they organized in their own way, they had their own areas of territorial control that they tried to maintain. And of course, they were, I say, in a sense, they were misreporting to the Caliphate about what was going on. They were claiming it's all fine. They selected one of their own as a governor, and basically they were trying to essentially cheat the Caliphate. But the Caliphate, of course, was a bit smarter than that, and they had some people within Khorasan, people typically who had been to Syria, been to Iraq. They were more co-opted into the ideology of the Caliphate, or perhaps it was a matter of personal connection, direct connection with some of the leaders of the Caliphate in the Middle East. And they started reporting to the Caliphate about what was really going on. And then what happened that the Caliphate decided to take action. So they were not going to tolerate this kind of free riding. They were sending money, they expected people to deliver. And they had no idea what an organization should be. So they didn't want a kind of bad cop of the Taliban. They had a very clear idea of what kind of organization they wanted. So they wanted, like the actual Islamic State in the Middle East, would say, if the Taliban are, they would say, the most anti-Leninist organization you can imagine, so they totally decentralized. The Caliphate wanted something. The Caliphate, essentially, the Islamic State is a Leninist organization. So they believe very much in centralization, or they believed at the beginning. They believed in a very disciplined organization, and they believed also they're actually also militarists. So they believed that war is war, and you fight it on the battlefield. And they wanted an organization, of course they knew that it wouldn't suddenly appear, but they wanted to develop an organization that, like the original Islamic State, would be able to fight like an army. So they wanted an organization that would be able to maneuver on the battlefield, would be able to concentrate and disperse, if you like, a hybrid military organization, like something like Hezbollah or like the Islamic State in the Middle East. So an organization that could fight a kind of conventional war against the Taliban, so exploiting their weakness, their, if you like, disorganization, but also fight as a guerrilla organization against a superior army like the Americans. That was the idea. And of course they knew that this bunch of guys who joined the Khorasan would not deliver that. It was pretty clear that these guys first didn't have the capacity of setting something like that up. Second, that they were interested in keeping their own things going, appointing their friends and their relatives around themselves. So basically, essentially was like the Taliban, essentially. They reproduced the organizational model they were familiar with because that's what they knew, essentially. So what happened that the Caliphate started sending people to take over, essentially, or at least to exert a degree of control over Khorasan. These people were two types of people, essentially. One type of people were, of course, Afghans and Pakistanis, Central Asians, who were in Iraq and Syria. They've been there for some time. And they were gradually, if you like, socialized into the original Islamic State. So they acquired this kind of, ideological mindset, but most importantly, they interiorized this organizational model. And typically these are people who acquired the name al-Mujahir when they went back, so people who had been fighting in the Middle East for years. In some cases, some joined as early as 2013. Several joined later, therefore stayed for a shorter period. But all people who were actually fluent in Arabic at that point, and they were sent back because they're seen as loyal to the actual caliphate, but also loyal to a model, loyal to an ideology. So not only to the leaders, but also people could be trusted to try to export, if you like, this model to Khorasan. And this was one type. The other type, of course, was Arabs. So some Arab advisors were sent to, again, support this process of, if you like, synchronization of Khorasan with the Islamic State. Now, our sources gave us numbers. It's very difficult to verify how many Arabs were there. The Arabs were able to speak to interpreters because, of course, these Arabs didn't speak any local languages, right? Arabs would not learn Pashto or Persian, right? It wouldn't be something they would do. In a way, they wouldn't stay there for very long periods of time. So they had interpreters, and we know that we managed to find some of these interpreters, interview them. We know that there are a lot of problems because there are too few interpreters. In a sense, it was a bit like the ISAF mission, the NATO mission in Afghanistan. They had the same issue, where you go, you come with your own idea about what to do in Afghanistan, which don't fit very well with the local culture, political, sociological environment. And then you speak the local language, so you need to use interpreters, which makes things even more complicated. So it turned out to be a very difficult, very big challenge for the Islamic State to synchronize the Khorasan and bring it up to standard. And they did adopt a number of kind of solutions that had some kind of impact. So they forced, for example, the different components to mix. So they imposed that, for example, none of them would have, if you like, a geographical fiefdom. they forced them to mix geographically. So they would order them, you send 50 people from your 5th dome in Kunar, you go to the south, the people from the south will come to you, and from the north you go to the south, from the south to the north. So they tried to force them to mix around. That might have had a little bit of an impact. But my view is that actually the biggest impact in eventually transforming the Islamic State in Khorasan into something more like the Islamic State was the Americans. Because the Americans, when they started realizing that this was real, and of course at the time that this big campaign going on against the Islamic State, which was one of the flagships of the Obama administration, therefore they had to fight them in Afghanistan as well. Even if these guys were actually not fighting the Americans, the Islamists in Khorasan, no intention at that stage to fight the Americans. They're not stupid, they would go and challenge the Americans when they were still very weak in a very early stage of development. They wanted to carve a niche, maybe more than a niche, for themselves in Afghanistan. The enemy was the Taliban, not the Americans. Of course, eventually they would turn against the Americans or against the Kabul government, but probably for years to go, the priority would have been fighting the Taliban, trying to push the Taliban out, especially of eastern Afghanistan. They really had this plan, therefore they could take eastern Afghanistan for themselves and push the Taliban out. They tried very hard. But the Americans decided to target them. And that had the impact, and of course the Americans were quite effective in targeting them, because the structure that the Islamic State was imposing on Khorasan was centralized, as I said, so it was a Leninist, if you like, organization that was centrally perfect for the Americans. The Americans were at the time implementing this night raid policy, this decapitation policy, which actually was not working with the Taliban. With the Taliban, there was nothing to decapitate the Taliban. The Taliban being decentralized, having multiple redundant networks. You could kill a lot of them, but the damage was limited because you had hundreds of networks. So you would decapitate one network, but you had another 299 that would continue working. You would decapitate another one, but overall the impact was negligible. But with the Islamic State it worked, because the Islamic State instead had a decentralized structure. So by killing the people at the top, that had an impact. And of course, one effect of American targeting, that the old generation, the first generation of leaders, ex-Taliban, ex-TTP, ex-Central Asian jihadists who joined, they were killed. So in a sense, they resolved the problem for the Islamic State. These guys who were not willing to essentially be synchronized or to fully merge into the Islamic State, they died, they were killed, and therefore, of course, somebody has to replace them. While this was happening, the Islamic State was able to organize a system of recruitment, training, and indoctrination. These Arabs and these Afghans and Pakistanis and Central Asians coming from the Middle East, their main job was this, to set up a system for, it was meant to be a system for expanding, of course, Khorasan, because Khorasan at the beginning was relatively small. It was not going to be able to defeat the Taliban and the Americans and the Kabul government with a few thousand people. So, of course, that was not controversial. It was accepted to everybody. We need to expand, we need to recruit. There is potential, but we need to train people, we need to develop our organization. And essentially what they did, they took control of the process of recruitment and training. There were a lot of, as you would expect, new recruits were not ex-Taliban, were not ex-TTP, were not coming from the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, from other Central Asian jihadist groups. They were just young villagers, especially from eastern Afghanistan initially, but then later a lot of Tajis from Kabul, from the northeast, who joined without having any particular background. They had not been in any, they're not been with any insurgent organization. They were 17, 16, 18, 19 years old. They were green recruits. And these guys were much more easier to synchronize because they didn't come with their baggage, right? They didn't come with their loyalties. And some of these people, it took a little while, but some of these people, of course, turned out to be quite good enough to become the next generation of cadre of the Islamic State. And indeed, the Islamic State today is quite a young organization. even the current governor is just in the early 30s, so it's quite remarkable that somebody that young has been able to reach a top position. It's not something that would happen with the Taliban, for example. So this generational change would not be possible without the American help, in a sense. Of course, the American didn't mean to help. The American meant to exterminate them, but the result was that the first generation was very dramatically weakened by these raids, especially the cadre, the leaders, the people we interviewed in the first 2 years. I don't think there's anyone alive anymore. We cannot find them anyway. It's difficult because they use aliases, right? So they don't tell you their real name. But in the last 2-3 years, we've not been able to find a single one of them. So some might have just quit, but we would know. We know that some people surrendered, of course, but we think the large majority were killed. So the transformation started happening. The success, I think, of the caliphate was to set up the system. That this, let's call them advisors, the dissent. It was a mix of advisors and what I would call political commissars. There were a few whose job was actually to, the job description was actually to supervise the leadership, the local leadership of the caliphate. And they were typically local people who had been in Syria and Iraq for a long time. They were particularly trusted by the central leadership. So this mix of political commissars and advisors managed to set up a system that produced a new, rank and file that was more loyal than the original leaders to the actual caliphate, and also a new cadre. And I think the creation of this new cadre is a big success because the rank and file has a very high rate of turnover, not only because of Kashmir, but also many people quit. I mean, especially the last 2-3 years, a lot of the common fighters of the caliphate have quit. Some surrendered to the Taliban, some of course were killed by the Taliban, but many simply quit. We know, and this is also you can see on social media, because sometimes they have appeals. They appeal to their members to rejoin or come out of hiding and restart fighting. And I think it's a clear indicator that many people decided that they had enough of it. And I will explain why is the case. But I think as in any organization, especially an organization that adopts, if you like, a Leninist model, the card are everything, right? So the card are the party, essentially. Without the card, the party disappears because it's a very structured organization, where the know-how, the historical memory, and the ability to do anything is concentrated in a few hundred of cadre. There are commanders, who are logisticians, finance specialists, indoctrinators. That's very important because when you recruit people, these people join, they have no idea, I don't really care about the Islamic State. They barely know that there is a Quran, they haven't even, some of them are illiterate. So without the indoctrinators spending 3 times with them, day and night, teaching them what it means to be a member of the Islamic State, you don't even have an army, right? So this, if you like, is the soul of the Islamic State in Khorasan, and that's what is really what makes a difference. And in practice, we have seen that they've been very pragmatic in recruiting people beyond this core. So of course, ideally, they want fresh recruits who have some ideological leaning towards them, so Salafis would be ideal. Or people they recruit a lot on universities, but typically people recruited in universities become cadre because, of course, you're educated, you're probably suitable for getting a job or some responsibility. But we see that when they have a shortage of manpower, they can be very pragmatic. They tried, for example, they brought in at some point former members, even militiamen of the previous Afghan government. They brought in people who essentially were fighting their own local wars for their own purposes, because they didn't have much faith in these people. But sometimes you need manpower. So occasionally they've been willing to mobilize local communities for their own purposes. But but always in a context where the card is there and manages the situation. If you like, you could call it a modular system, where you have a very disciplined, very professional card, which is able to pragmatically, even cynically, if you like, mobilize local communities, for example, defend your community for another community. And we've seen this not only in Khorasan, but in the Sahel, for example. So they mobilize these local communities. They're disposable. They don't care. They actually are willing to take immense casualties, because these people are not really ideological, committed members of the Islamic State, so they're expendable. What is not expendable is a card that manages them. So the card is really what they try to protect, and they invest really their resources in maintaining the card. They're offering, now it's more difficult because of the financial difficulties that they've been having, but at the peak of their power, when the Caliph was able to give them quite a nice budget, they were offering for their card very nice packages like good salaries, but also benefits like, depending on how many family members they had, they would get benefits. They were encouraged to marry, and of course in a country of Afghanistan where people marry very young, and for especially people of limited means, getting married is a big issue. They almost created the kind of wedding agency for the members. They would, you had many cases of more senior people giving their daughters in marriage to promising new members. They were expected to emerge as commanders and cadre, to keep them in the organization and to motivate them. And they encourage, because also recruit some women, especially university students, so they encourage them to marry their fellow comrades, from the organization. And when they marry, there are incentives like additional benefits. You have children, again, more benefits. And they try to offer, when we're able to have camps and bases in remote parts of Afghanistan, they offer them quite nice conditions. There were schools, they were living with their families. This is not something the Taliban ever did, right? So this is not very common in such organization where you are offered a condition where you can take your family with you, with children. Of course, there are dangers involved. One person I knew well who joined took his wife and 2 children, they all died. Okay, so you take them to the battle zone, right? But for these people, apparently the risk was worth it. But so basically, it was an organization that was almost offering kind of middle-class paths. So these people were coming out of universities, and of course, now, but even before, if you come out of an Afghan university, it's not that your career path is guaranteed, because the quality of local degrees is not having high esteem by employers of any kind, even now. So typically you end up unemployed, actually. That's basically what happens to you if you come out of an Afghan university, especially state universities. So by offering them this kind of career path, with the salary, with incentives, okay, they didn't have, it was not exactly an American way of life. They didn't have big cars. But for example, many of them ended up being managing, if you like, operation in these cities. They were given flats, okay? They were given flats, houses, by the organization. And I know people were doing logistics and finance and they were outside Afghanistan. They had nice flats in the Gulf, for example, or before and later in Turkey. So essentially, the conditions they were offered, the packages were very attractive. So but I'm not trying to say they were, mercenaries, but I think what I'm trying to say that the Islamic State valued their card to the extent they would really offer them very attractive packages to keep these people in and motivate them. We're talking about a total of probably several hundred people. It's difficult to have an exact number because although they gave us a lot of numbers, they wouldn't, of course it's not their definition. They don't use the term card. The term card is really of Leninist inspiration. If you tell them, oh, you are Leninist, they shoot you, right? So it's not they seeing themselves, but clearly this is coming from the Brotherhood, which in turn took this kind of organizational methodology from the Leninists, right? So it is probably third hand, not even second hand. They're not even, I think, aware of it, it's not the way they think. But I think it's clear that compared to the Taliban, this is very obvious, they really invest, I would say, most of the resources, actually, in the creation and in maintaining this cadre. So the losses they suffered have been terrible, and especially in 2023, they had a terrible financial crisis because the caliphate was not in a position to send a lot of money anymore, and they've never been very good at raising money locally. So really they were not able to, they didn't have much money, but they rather let a lot of people go, like fighters, and they basically at one point completely suspended operations. For some months, the Islamic State in Khorasan was doing nothing, but they tried to maintain this cadre, because I think they understand very well, the cadre is organization, and vice versa. So this is very important, because since I also worked in, tried to essentially fight the Islamic State, my view is that it's pointless trying to, kill the fighters. I mean, of course, if they attack you, you have to fight back. But the fighters, the common people, the lowest rank of the organization are expendable from their point of view and easily replaceable. This is true of Afghanistan, because if you go to eastern Afghanistan, there's no shortage of young Salafis who hate the Taliban and are willing to join to defend the community, or what they think is defending the community. And the only limitation that the Islamic State doesn't have money, right? So they have to keep the numbers relatively small. Or if you go to, say, the Sahel, there will be the entire community where you can probably very easily recruit young guys. There was a case in the Middle East before, it might be the case in various other locations as well. That doesn't lead anywhere. So basically, killing the lower ranks doesn't defeat the Islamic State. Where the vulnerability is this cadre organization, because of course every cadre you lose is somebody who has a lot of, first of all, is educated. The cadre are always either they prefer university educated people. If you don't find enough, they will use madrasa educated people. They prefer university educated, because they need people really operatives, right? They need people who understand easily how to use a computer, how to use Excel. They're big fans of Excel, how to move money, how to do logistics. They need people, they recruit a lot from the Islamic law faculty, but also from madrasas when there's a matter of recruiting indoctrinators. So the people who will spend months with the fresh recruits to basically to convince them that the Islamic State is a real Islam. But the others are essentially professionals who have specific skills. And for that, you want people with a university degree. There will be some people with high school degrees, but essentially you need a university degree. So it's not that simple, of course, to recruit people with university degrees if there is repression going on. Of course, if nobody does anything, it's easy, but typically the Islamic State is being hunted down wherever it is, and Taliban, they realized pretty quickly that the Islamic State was very active in the campuses, so they really cracked down on the campuses. And we know the Islamic State source acknowledged to us that now doing face-to-face recruitment in the campuses is too dangerous. They keep doing it online, so they still try to recruit people through social media, but face-to-face is become something they can only do occasionally. So basically, if they are confident that the person is genuine, then you might at some point meet him, But we do even see on social media a lot of complaints that people are being recruited on social media. And 6 months later, they haven't seen anybody from the Islamic State. So it's very difficult for them, because the Taliban are really after them. And when they started hitting in the cities, the Taliban got seriously worried about that, and they really invested, if you like, resources in going after the Islamic State. So typical, classical resources, intelligence, information, informers, networks in the campuses, etc. So in that, the Taliban have been effective. They're not very good at countering social media activities, but in this kind of more classical, counter-terrorist things, they learned the trade quite quickly. So I think that already highlights a vulnerability, right? So that any loss, within this card structure is difficult to replace. I think it's, we estimated that they've been recruiting around 2022, 2023, recruiting around 100 new cards per year, which doesn't seem a lot, but they're cards, okay? So, and I think they've been barely able to maintain the core structure. So if you could either reduce recruitment or increase casualties, you would shrink the card. And any shrink of the card, so the card, say there are 800 of them, if you lose 80, it's already 10% shrinking. It's not something that is irrelevant. They can easily cope with losing 20% or 30% of the fighters. But if you reduce the card structure, it means that something has to go. Either the indoctrinators are no longer there, or the logisticians are no longer there, or the worst of all, the finance specialists are no longer there, because the finance specialist, the money doesn't come through. If you don't have the social media specialists, although many are not even in Afghanistan, but those who are in Afghanistan, if you lose them, then recruitment doesn't happen, right? So any shrinkage of this card structure really does some kind of damage. It's not something that you can sacrifice. Now, so that was a transformation, and I think what we had in 2022, 2023 was an organization that has really graduated as a kind of proper Islamic State structure. Of course, it will not be, exactly a clone of the original one. Anyway, they're not Arabs, that cultural differences, but they're much more closer to the original than the Islamic State in the Sahel, for example. But that's not the end of the story. I think one thing that is very important, I already mentioned it, in starting already in reality with the fall of Mosul, but increasingly so over the years, the money that they were receiving started shrinking. So the caliphate, of course, as their own resources started being reduced, they didn't have money to spare for their provinces, of course. And of course, in those days, they were fighting very hard for Mosul and for Raqqa. So you can imagine that the priority were not Khorasan. So the money started going down quickly. And of course, when the last territorial presence of the Islamic State in Syria was essentially wiped out, it became even harder. Because not only because there is not much money, but also because the simple task of transferring money is not something you do from the Syrian desert in reality. You need to have some facilities. Now, of course, we know now that starting from probably around 2018, they started moving massively into Turkey. They started establishing networks in Turkey, especially logistics and finance. So Turkey became the bank of the Islamic State, not only Khorasan, but over the central structure, but also Syria and Iraq. I don't know about Africa, but for sure, at least these ones. We know that the Islamic State in Khorasan at the time had hundreds of members in Turkey doing essentially finance, a little bit of recruitment, but mostly finance. And they had the money there. They had bought, they used the reserves, financial reserves, to buy properties, establish companies. That also helps you to justify money movements, of course. But of course, Turkey, with the massive Afghan migration of recent years, one thing that always goes with Afghans wherever they go is our banking. So with our banking in Turkey, it becomes possible to transfer money without bypassing the banking system, of course, to Afghanistan and to Pakistan as well. So that became the Bank of Khorasan, and was very convenient because it was also the Bank of the Islamic State Central. So transferring money from one to the other, very easy, because they would just be basically, well, it would be like a bank transfer for us, right? So the money actually doesn't move. You just say, okay, this money now is yours. The money wouldn't have to move because they're all in Turkey. The point was transferring that from Turkey, transferring the cash to Afghanistan and Pakistan for operations. But that became increasingly complicated when the Turks started cracking down on these networks. Thousands of people have been detained. Of course, many have been released, but certainly hundreds have been in prison. Many of them are from Khorasan, from the Khorasan branch. Property has been seized, which means a loss of financial reserves. The Taliban, of course, are not stupid, so they also started monitoring hawala transactions as much as they can. It's difficult because, by definition, hawala transactions are informal, so there's only so much you can do. But they go to hawala traders in Kabul and say, if we catch you, you're dead. And that's their way of reducing the availability of hawala traders to work for the Islamic State. So the money became a real problem. And that was a very important issue, but became compounded more recently because the crackdown is really beginning to convince the leadership of the Islamic State, the crackdown in Turkey, that 2-3 years from now, they will have been wiped out. Because it's a very massive structure, they have a lot of money there in various shapes and forms. But of course, the Turks have their own efficient ways, if you like, maybe not very human rights compliant ways, but efficient ways of making people talk. So once you start detaining hundreds and hundreds, then information starts emerging, about the structure, where the money is, other people are working, within the same structure. So I think they realized that they will lose the Turkish network. They tried to fight back, but essentially the Turks seem to be determined because they realized that the Islamic State was not only moving a lot of people into Turkey, but also recruiting a lot of Turks, which was much more worrying for the Turkish authorities. So that led to the situation where the leadership now thinks that there's no point in trying to, save their resources, to fight a long war, because they will lose them anyway. So they decided, I think, probably a couple of years ago when the crackdown started really becoming serious, they decided they needed to relaunch the caliphate, and they needed to use the remaining resources, human resources, but most importantly, financial resources to relaunch it. So I think, because people, are aware of the big attacks that take place, most of all Crocus Hall in Moscow, because of course, not because of the number of people who died, but because of the media reporting and the graphic images. Some Spaniards have been killed in Afghanistan by the Islamic State. There was not much of a stir because there are no images. But Crocus Hall, because of the continued and widespread and graphic reporting, has made a huge impact. So they tried, we know, of course, there's an issue of whether we believe the Iranians and the Russians when they report that they have foiled 1, 2, 3, 10, 20 plots, I think they foiled some plots where there's really 20 or 30, who knows, especially the Iranians, they report constantly, foiling Islamic State plots. So maybe there is some question mark there about, how many plots they're really foiling. Also because, for what I know, they don't have, the Islamic State doesn't have a huge structure in Iran that they can, put together tens of plots every year. But whatever the case, between 30 and 50 plots have failed over the last couple of years. So they're really trying to do something. They really struggled. They had 2 big successful attacks outside Afghanistan, Kerman in Iran, and Crocus Hall, and some smaller attacks which didn't really have much of an impact. But the important thing is Crocus Hall, because I think the impact went well beyond the expectations. I think they now fully realize that the relaunch can function, can work, but you need, there's no point in killing Afghans. Nobody cares about Afghans. So you can blow up a lot of Shia Afghans in Kabul or even Afghanistan. Nobody will even realize what happens. The Taliban, by the way, prevent the media from extensive reporting on these attacks, especially with images. So there's no impact. So they understand that the relaunch only functions if you can have media exposure. And Crocus Hall demonstrated that very graphically. That's what you need. They also understand that they need to show to the potential co-citizens, people could give money to them, people could join, but especially money. The issue now is more than recruiting is money. You need to align yourself with the, if you like, the concerns that are predominant in the Muslim world. They need to show that you do something, that you are they're still the lead jihadist organization in the world, because people are beginning to doubt that the Islamic State is still a viable organization. So, for example, there have been at least 2 or 3 attempts to attack synagogues, because we can see also on the jihadist charts, that the fact that the Islamic State never does anything on Israel, is really something that many see as very dodgy, because you say you are the lead jihadist organization, but Israel, nothing happens. You kill Afghans, but not Israel, so it seems strange. I think they realize they need to do something about that. The Russians say they follow the plot, the Turks say they follow the plot. There is a certain pattern there. But I think most important is the media. It needs to be in the media. So, of course, arguably, you need to carry out attacks where there will be media exposure, places like Europe, Russia, because Russia society, although I wouldn't define Russia as a great democracy, but it's different from Iran. In Iran, the regime has much more handle on social media. In Russia, there's no handle, so everything can go, everything happens on social media, as we saw with the Crocus Hall attack. So if you do something in Russia, there will be exposure, like in Europe. There is no chance of that being contained. And since there was, these guys in Afghanistan, they were ecstatic after Crocus Hall, because they had the feeling this is something that's going to change the equation. But the important transformation that is happening, I think, is that they know that with the change in the geopolitical situation the last few years, they're not going to have, like in the past, some big donors will give them a lot of money. And I describe this in my book, and this is one of the most controversial bits of my book. Like when I try to write about this in Syria, mentioning that some Gulf states were giving money, although actually they themselves don't necessarily deny it, but there was a big reaction. But now they know that this has changed. They know that the kind of geopolitical situation created by the Syrian war, for example, is over. That kind of motivation is no longer there. So that will not happen. Of course it could have, and they say from time to time after particularly the Kerman attack, there were some people in some Gulf countries were willing to give $100,000 in one go, which was something unheard for years, But they know that they cannot count on that anymore. So they need to change their fundraising approach. And they're moving to an approach where instead of relying on a few big donors, you have to rely on many small donors. So the men in the mosque, especially Salafi mosque, wherever in the world, people can give 10, 20, 30 euros. But how do you motivate these people to pay? Because if you go to a big sheikh somewhere in the Gulf, you can make an argument, we want to upset the Russians, or we want to punish the Russians for Syria, or punish the Iranians for Syria, whatever, For the man in the street, you need something graphic, you need the media, you need to be on the media, right? So that the Crocus Hall attack is a model, if they can replicate it, because that attack was successful in part because of Russian flaws, but anyway, if you can replicate this type of attacks, that's what you need to get the small guy who might have some sympathy but is somewhere in Northern Europe and is modest resources, but you need hundreds of thousands of them to pay. That's the challenge. So if you like a funding model, more like a mass political party as opposed to a little oligarchy that goes for 10 million here, 10 million there. I'll stop here.
Yeah.
And I think I
much, Antonio, for this very granular presentation, very interesting and with a lot of details. I have many questions, and I'm going to put it in my bad broken English. First of all, does the Gaza war has any effect on the propaganda of ISK? Did you see any kind of change in their discourses, or how can we be a Khorasan organization and also being part of the global networks and having a view on what is happening in Gaza? Do you think the Hizb ut-Tahrir, which was very powerful and influential in Central Asia, has any kind of influence on them? Do some people left Hizb ut-Tahrir, or was it a kind of, did it create a kind of atmosphere which might have facilitated any kind of recruitment? You didn't speak at all about the ethnic differences in the social makeup. I mean, do they recruit among Pashtuns, Tajik? Do they care about this? Is it one kind of differences between the Taliban, which was much more Pashtun-oriented, even if you wrote in your book that it was able to recruit in other ethnic groups? I wondered if it had any pertinence, importance, at least in the strategy. You insisted a lot about the media exposure and the way that terrorists attack our way, which was also the case for Al-Qaeda. Once you have a big terrorist attack, you can much more easily attract funders, have money, trying to do fundraising in a much more efficient way. So if we follow this argument, we might be a little bit worried about the Olympic Games in Paris, in France, in the future, because of course there are many incentives, and I mean it would be a great occasion to attract money and having a big media exposure. What else did I wanted to? Do we have any? So, if I understood you well, you mean that they don't need anymore their mother organization, which is the Islamic State in the Middle East, that is now able to be autonomous thanks to its own logic of recruiting young poor in villages, having these differences between cadre and much more educated people and villages, and so where do they find the incentives? Is it just criticizing the Taliban? Do we still have, you didn't speak too much about ideology, maybe it's not that important. I mean, do the Devons-nous line against Salafi, do they stress in their ideology the critique of the Devons-nous ideology? Is it something, once again, useful in their speeches? Do they have any? There is no backing from any kind of state, even from the Gulf, maybe private donors. Well, this was the few questions that I had, and I leave the floor also to you afterwards, Pierre. But you can, and then of course, to the audience. If you have you have the opportunity to answer, then I will give the.
Right. Should I answer first?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so, right. So I want to clarify, and I think there was some discussion on this in the media also. The media largely misreported about the Khorasan attack. The Islamists in Khorasan did not claim the attack in Moscow. They were involved, but what happened is that the Islamic State, the caliphate, the central structure of the Islamic State has been degraded to a very large extent after, especially they lost any kind of territorial control in Syria. So they're not in a position, I would be suicide in fact, to have, like in the past, a small, not so small actually, bureaucracy of terror, like, these entities that were managing cells around the world. So you had one managing Europe, one managing Russia, etc. So, and this is where, managing means, you have tens of cells, you need to help them. They don't just happen, to be there and you leave them to a device. You need to send money, you need to help them to find weapons, explosive, you need to kind of even try to indoctrinate as much as you can remotely, maybe move people around to some extent in some places where you can do that. So it's quite a, you need quite a relatively large manpower to do that, plus all the other things you do as Islamic State, right? You have to manage your own people, your own infrastructure. So if you had like 20 to 30 guys managing Central Asians in the Syrian desert online, right, speaking Central Asian languages, the American drones flying over your head, it wouldn't take long before they find you, right? It's not normal in a Syrian village in the desert to have a lot of internet activity, encrypted, even encrypted activities, like saying, we are here, come and bomb us, right? So they had to stop doing that. They tried to do it from Turkey, but the Turks are after them. So what they did, I think a couple of years ago, they told Khorasan, okay, you got a lot of Central Asians, you got this case in the mountains of Badakhshan, do it from there. I mean, it's not easy, but at least, you know, the Americans won't bomb you there. And that's how they started getting involved. In fact, the entire responsibility for all the Central Asians within the Caliphate has been transferred to Khorasan. Even those who are still in Syria, they're under responsibility of Khorasan, those in Turkey, because essentially it's a language issue. You know, they don't have the ability at the time, okay, some you speak Arabic. There's been a lot of dislocation. These people are, you can see from the information we have about those who are killed or detained, they live in basements, in caves. Sometimes they hide in flats in Turkey. They're not in a position to organize easily. Oh, I want a translator from Uzbek, send him. I want, so it's just like they're surviving essentially. So they decided, okay, you do it. You at least have this kind of caves in the upper valley of Kastak in Badakhshan. Of course, it's not an ideal place, so doing a lot of internet activity, but you can do a little bit from there. The Americans have an unwritten agreement with the Taliban that they fly over, but they don't bomb. So that actually pays in the end of the Islamic State, because they know that there are drones in the air, but they don't get bombed, for now at least. So these people, that's what the Americans say Islamic State in Khorasan was involved, because these are the people who manage the Central Asian, even those in Russia, right? But the strategy comes from the leadership. The leadership says, we want attacks in Russia. Do it. It's not Khorasan that decides. And Khorasan is not allowed to claim these attacks, because the Caliphate is saying, you work for us anyway, So, of course, now, I could see that at the beginning when this started, Khorasan was they're actually almost despondent. They're saying, what? We are in Badakhshan, and it's like, 3,000 meters above sea level. There's no electricity. You need to use generators. It's not that you have, internet. You need to do with satellites or whatever. It's not easy. It's a cost also. You need to spend a lot of money when you do these things with satellite phones. They were not particularly happy to have to do that. Then Kerman came, and with the Kerman attack, they actually started changing, because they started to realize, wait a moment. Of course, if you fail after 20, 30 failures, you think, I don't really want to do this. After success, especially that translates into some funding, you start thinking perhaps there's some logic in this. And after Crocus Hall, as I said, on the chart, but also the people we know who, deal with these guys all the time, because they're doctors, they are village elders, and they are villagers who are members. They meet them all the time, they talk to them. They say that they were ecstatic. After Crocus Hall, there was a feeling, this is a turning point. So now I'm thinking that this way, if this continues, if the central structure can't strengthen its position, which I don't see how they can do as long as they are where they are, that could lead to a growing autonomy in general, of the provinces, but especially of Khorasan, if they're able to establish direct fundraising links. If they can raise their own money without going through the Caliphate, in the past they are forced to rely on the Caliphate. So those who wanted to fund Khorasan, typically to give the money to the Caliphate would transfer, because the Caliphate is not stupid. They're not going to allow their provinces to have their own fundraising, because it's a recipe for separation, right? But if they can do that now, because the Caliphate is not able to manage this anymore, that could lead to a situation where the Khorasan becomes more and more independent. We know that now they do their own fundraising in Europe. Now in Europe you will have places where they say fund Khorasan. They don't say fund the Caliphate, but they say fund Khorasan. So you have indication that they are gradually going that direction, but they're not reached the stage where we would say we Khorasan. On Gaza, mostly they use Gaza to criticize the Taliban, because they say, you haven't done anything, you haven't sent volunteers. Of course, how do you send volunteers from Afghanistan to Gaza? It's not clear to me. But it's a bit like they do the same with Hamas. They criticize Hamas. which from their perspective doesn't make much sense because, Hamas could say, well, I mean, at least they are there to fight. You are, hundreds of kilometers away and killing mostly Muslims, so you're not in a position. But they do that, they criticize Hamas, they criticize the Taliban. So they're not using the Gaza issue for example, recruitment purposes. But of course, in Afghanistan, people don't care very much about Gaza, generally speaking. So it wouldn't be a very effective way of attracting recruits. I think we've seen in Turkey is different. In Turkey, Khorasan was involved in one of these plots to attack a synagogue because, as I said, I think there is a very strong feeling you have to show you do something. Of course, you can't do anything in Israel. I mean, you could, perhaps some Palestinian would one day, and apparently one already did it, say, I join the Islamic State online and take a knife and kill somebody. But in terms of them organizing something, they can't because they have no presence there. What they could do, of course, they identify any Jewish community anywhere as Israelis, right, or linked to Israel. So synagogue in Turkey, synagogue in Russia, or I would think perhaps if that fails, even Jewish schools, right, in somewhere in Europe or wherever. So that is something that they're involved in, but if there are people in Turkey who kind of handle this, I don't think they're that interested in, the people actually in Afghanistan are that interested in Gaza. They have other things to worry about. On Hizb ut-Tahrir, Hizb ut-Tahrir now in Afghanistan, I mean, originally when the regime change took place, they were a bit reluctant at the beginning, but then they decided to endorse the Taliban. The Taliban don't really care, and they, like any other organization, they ban their activities, and they are implementing the ban more and more strictly. So there is a lot of disaffection within Hizb ut-Tahrir. Of course, the endorsement was pragmatic. I don't think that there's much sympathy for the Taliban. But what we know is that many members of Hizb ut-Tahrir have ended up in the Islamic State, not only Khorasan, but also elsewhere. And I think it's easy to understand because the non-violent approach of Hizb ut-Tahrir, with young guys who get recruited, they realize after 1 or 2 years of doing, social activism that to convert the world to Islam as they should do will take probably 200,000 years, right? So when you have a lot of testosterone that, you want to do something, it's probably not a very attractive option. But the Islamic State says, no, you need violence, we can do things now. So that becomes attractive to some of these people. So we definitely have, especially in Afghanistan, Hizb ut-Tahrir attracted quite a lot of Tajiks. And here we come to the ethnics, especially in recent years. In part, I think there was an original group or cell, or several cells of Hizb ut-Tahrir who joined. And then once they were there, they started bringing in more and more Tajiks. So that now much of the card structure are Tajiks, and also because they recruit in Kabul University, they've been really hurt very much in Jalalabad University, which used to be one of the strongest, which is a place where you have a lot of Pashtuns. Because they don't recruit much more, but they still recruit in Kabul and some other universities in the north, they recruit more and more Tajik card as opposed to earlier. So I think there's a growing Tajikization, if you like, at the card level. The leaders are mostly Pakistanis anyway, but most of the educated recruits now are Tajiks. You still have a lot of foot soldiers who are Pashtuns. Then what else was there? The media exposure, the Olympic Games. I think any opportunity for them, they will try to seize. As I hinted, the reality is that they don't have a lot of capacity now. Okay, so 2 successes out of 50 attempts is not a particularly good rate. I mean, even the successes were, of course, when you go for soft targets and you're ready to shoot anybody, it's relatively easy, So none of these attacks were against military targets. So they're all against soft targets like churches, synagogues. Well, some were against embassies and consulates that might be harder, But none of them was military targets. So when you succeed twice out of 50 attempts against soft targets, it's not a demonstration actually of a lot of skill. because these people they're using mostly are either Central Asian who fought in Syria. They're good at fighting, but they are fighting like an army, right? They're not terrorists. They're not trained as terrorists. Or people who are doing logistics and finance in Turkey. Again, they're not trained terrorists. It's not, you know, it's not that easy to do an effective terrorist attack. And therefore, you know, one hopes, but of course they will try to develop, you know, this kind of skills. There are rumors of what they call training camps in Turkey, which I think probably are houses, large houses, you know, with maybe a compound around them, to teach the new recruits among the refugees in Turkey to, well, at least to shoot, to do something, because, you know, many of these have no clue about even fighting. So perhaps at some point they will get there, but of course the situation is where you don't have any territorial control. It's not so easy to train people proficiently because, you know, you can go somewhere like in Istanbul shooting around, you know, and they let's fire Kalashnikov, you know, then the police will come to you. So I think they have this kind of issues. And on the ideology, they don't talk very much about ideology, because I think within their rank there's still people who watch Deobandi, you know, some from the original wave. So and especially Pakistanis, so they don't want to raise this kind of issues too much, because, you know, it could be counterproductive. The criticism tends to be, for example, they don't openly raise the takfir, you know, in their propaganda in Afghanistan, because although they do say, you know, we need to kill Shias, but the argument is revenge for Syria. They won't say, you know, it's because they're Shia, but they say it's a revenge because, you know, they were sending volunteers to fight in Syria. So they try to avoid, probably they realize that in that particular context, this kind of heavily ideological approach wouldn't be very useful.
Maybe also they also exploited what happened negatively within the Islamic State. This kind of issue provoked internecine division.
Yeah, I think it might be even internally controversial, because not, as I said, not all the people who join are, you know, really that close to the ideology. I think it's becoming increasingly ideological, but there's still a lot of people with the, you know, for example, even many of these Salafis are joining, but they are, you know, I feel like doctrinally they're still, you know, all the ulema that we talk to, Salafi ulema in Afghanistan, they actually doctrinally are quietist. They argue not for jihad, but they argue for defending the community because the Taliban are oppressing us. So if you start saying, you know, no, we need to, you know, any Muslim who does not support us is not a Muslim, then that wouldn't go down well, even with these clerics who are supporting them.
Thank you very much, Professor Giustozzi, for this extremely detailed presentation and interesting lecture about the Islamic State in Khorasan. We are delighted with the Grand Continent to be associated with this event, and so because we are trying to bring together with the Journal Grand Continent the world of the academia, the world of the public debate, and the world of public policy. And so in this regard, this subject of the Islamic State and your presentation is very representative of what we are trying to do. So thank you very much, Bernard Rouvier, Amélie and Elie for having associated us. Before handing the floor to the public, we have two additional guests who would like to intervene and ask questions. First of all, Kamia Assaï, who is a career diplomat but speaks as a private citizen, and who is also a regular collaborator to the Grand Continent, with whom I published several articles and interviews about global politics. So, Kamia, please.
Thank you so much. So, thank you for a fascinating talk. So, I teach international relations. I will be speaking here in private capacity just for the questions. So, first question I had was on the sort of, it's more on the political side or structural side, the centralized versus decentralized debate. So, I was wondering whether the emphasis put on the action, terrorist acts, sort of has an impact where different groups don't engage on the debate, as to basically what principles the organization as a whole adheres to. Are there tendencies, subgroups, or not at all? And the only thing which matters when a new recruit comes is its ability to wage a terrorist attack. So that was one question. The second was more on the geographic aspect that we've mentioned. So on the interaction between several theaters in which the Islamic State evolves, Khorasan, the Levant, and also the Maghreb. So I was wondering, to what extent does 𝐈𝐸𝐥𝐚𝐬𝐭 conceive its ability to have a global scope in terms of action? So we've seen the scope of their actions expanding gradually, but in your assessment today, to what extent are they able to project power in Europe from a concrete sort of point of view? How do you see the trajectory evolve potentially over the next few years? We've mentioned just the information space, so the Grand Continent works on this question. You mentioned the fact that they sort of look at different expertise amongst their members. I was wondering, how do they value the expertise regarding communication, social media, what happens after the attack? Is it, are they centered on people who have a knowledge of explosives, but is social media expertise also valued a lot? Do you see this trend evolving or not? A last question was more specifically on the Afghan case. So we know that they target Shiite, the Hazara community. Were you surprised over the last few years when you've seen the Taliban adapt to the fact that they target Shiite? Because they have at times developed discourse trying to put forward the fact that they would be protecting order. The discourse of the Taliban regarding Shiites has changed to a certain point, or it has, as opposed to 20 years ago. So do you think that, the Taliban has reactively embraced the more pan-Afghan nationalist stance, or do you think not at all? We have an idea on how it should. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, you can answer now and then.
Right.
It's supposed to turn green.
Yeah. Thank you for your questions. So in fact, your point about centralization is on spot, because I should have said that in the last transformation, one thing that I have to do now is to give up on centralization. They don't say it, because of course it means they're becoming more and more like Al-Qaeda. So essentially the initial raison d'etre, one of the raison d'etre of the Islamic State was that Al-Qaeda had this approach, like very long term, avoid direct confrontation, build structures and capabilities for the long term. But the Islamic State will say, no, now we can establish the caliphate now, and we have the capacity to create an army now, to create a state now, and will be, because it was because of the input of the Ba'athists that would join, have this kind of skills. But anyway, that was the argument. Now that, of course, is not doable anymore at all. It's not doable in Afghanistan, it's not doable in Syria, it's not doable in Iraq, they don't do it even in Sahel. So I think they're giving up, but they can't say they're giving up because they would imply they were wrong, and they were wrong. Now that Al-Qaeda was right from their perspective, that strategy could have yielded short-term results, but long-term disasters. And I think it's pretty obvious, but they can't admit it. So in Afghanistan, they had this transition where they completely abandoned, even before the Taliban at the time, to say, let's do a big offensive and destroy the last few Islamist strongholds in the Far East. They abandoned them because they knew that if the Taliban were to come, they wouldn't be able to resist. So they abandoned them, and it took several months, maybe a year, but they completely transitioned to a system of cells where there are no fixed bases anymore. It's all mobile. And of course in the cities is like typical terrorist cells that don't even communicate with each other. It's all very decentralized now. They even abandoned the idea of a central headquarters, and now they have three. Even Khorasan alone has got 3 headquarters, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Pakistan, each with his own region, so they do their own separate things. So it's a complete transition to a different model. And of course, the more you take on this goal, of managing Central Asian cells. And of course, the Central Asian are the terrorist elite of the Islamic State now for specific reasons, which maybe we can elaborate about. But anyway, when managing these people, by definition, they have to be ultra decentralized, otherwise, they will get wiped out very, very quickly. In terms of capacity, as I was saying, they found themselves almost by chance. They didn't expect this. It was because of dynamics within the caliphate, the central leadership, not having to do with Khorasan, that they decided, okay, we cannot handle the Central Asia anymore. There are a lot of them. It's hard work, to handle these people who don't speak Arabic. They're good, but now we are fighting a guerrilla war in the desert. We hide in caves, we hide in basements. We don't have time to, meet with the Central Asia and tell them what to do, what not to do. Plus, can you fight a guerrilla war if you are Uzbek in Syria? Probably not. I mean, you stand out. You will get caught very quickly. So they decide, you leave, you go where you can, go to Turkey, go to Central Asia, go to Afghanistan, but you leave because we can't support you anymore. We can't spend money and resource on you. We have very little resource and you are not useful now, sorry. So they decided, okay, who can handle them? Language is important, right? Because if you have to handle, there are probably a few thousands Central Asians around the world, with the Islamic State. Most of them don't speak Arabic, right? So to handle them, you need people who, it's much easier if you do speak their languages. So given that Khorasan has a lot of Central Asians, in Afghanistan mostly, that they control one of the three headquarters I just mentioned, the one in Badakhshan. So let's do it, you do it, right? So you got the headquarters. Yeah, it's not like being in Istanbul or being in a city, right? It's one of the most remote places in Afghanistan. It's a valley where the previous government had not even mapped. We don't even know the name of the village in this valley because nobody ever mapped it. It's out there, but so it means that surely they don't have, fiber broadband there. It's not ideal for doing this kind of stuff, but at least you stay alive because this stage for the Islamic State is staying alive. They're trying to survive. Now, we are worried that they're going to blow up our places, but for them, it's survival now. It's not the Islamic State of 2014-15. This is the last fight. Okay, if they don't win this one, they go extinct. So they are fighting for survival. So in that context, they do what they can with the resources they have, which are not a lot. They are using people. They have some manpower, especially these Afghans and mostly Afghans in Turkey. They have these Central Asians. There are quite several hundreds in between Syria and Turkey. They have some Turks. They have Arabs, but the Arabs are mostly used to protect the leadership in Syria and Iraq. They use these guys, but these guys are not professional trained terrorists, right? They are what they are. Some of them have refused to fight. A lot of them have gone back to Central Asia. There are a lot of them who have been going back to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and other Central Asian countries, surrendering to the local authorities. There are some who are hiding in Turkey who don't want to go back because they're not sure what will happen to them, but don't want to fight either. So they are there because in Turkey, if you are an Uzbek, okay, you can, you're not a total stranger. There are Central Asian communities that are settled there, right? There are Turkish citizens. There are Uyghurs who are settled there. Maybe you can hide. Somebody can give you a room in a basement, and you can survive there, somehow. So many people quit. Those who stay, some of them are willing to do logistical or financial work. Not all of them are willing to blow themselves up. They're not all willing to die. It's a small minority, but because two factors. One, these are people who made the choice of going from Russia to Syria to fight. So it's not something small, It means that they already, a certain mindset. I've seen a lot of things, a lot of dying, a lot of killing. They've done a lot of killing. They know that it's not going back for them because they're a track record, okay? So for some of them, there's a choice, they're willing. At the same time, the caliph doesn't need them, they're expendable. unfortunately for them, that's the situation. You know, they're not useful in Syria, they're not useful in Iraq because they're not Arabs, they're not local. They don't serve much purpose in Turkey because the Turks are dismantling everything. What do you do with them? Some are going back to Afghanistan because maybe one day they will do jihad in Central Asia. Some are surrendering, as I said. Some are willing to do attacks and die, right? Because essentially these are one-way tickets. Whether suicide or not is a one-way ticket. So they're not chosen because they are very skillful or prepared, just because what they have is a human resource that they have now to do something. Is a relaunch done, is a last ditch, right? Is a last ditch, is a relaunch done with whatever is left, you know, of the once glorious Islamic State. So I think their capabilities are limited. The problem is also in Europe now to procure explosive weapons is hard, okay? So to do something big with a knife is difficult, right? So you need weapons. And the reality is that the police force and the intelligence force of Europe, Europol, but also the national ones, are much better now. They didn't sit idly. You know, Europol now they have quite a strong capability in terms of monitoring, communication. There's a lot of interception. Collaboration with the Americans, we've got drones flying where the leaderships are. They intercept a lot of communications. Not everything, you know, but it's not easy for them. So we have to think, you know, in these terms. Yes, they're a threat, but remember, this is the last battle. I mean, unless they succeed in relaunching, and then it's no longer the last battle, you know. But I think it's a very difficult situation for them.
On va laisser quelques questions. Je sais pas si vous en avez.
I mean, there's also. Thank you very much for yourself. But there is also perhaps Amélie Chely would like to.
Amélie.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much for this clear presentation. I have just one question regarding the psychological dimension of the rhetoric of Islamic State. We know that this dimension is obvious in their ideology. Even the name which has been chosen for Daesh in Afghanistan shows that aspect. Khorasan, that means the appearance of the sun, refers to an episode of the Islamic traditional history, saying that from the land of Khorasan, a false messiah at the head of an army of enemies of justice is to appear. And I wanted to know, is this dimension central in Daesh Khorasan rhetoric?
I mean, in terms of what they think, it's difficult to say, but it doesn't feature much in their propaganda at all, actually, I would say. I'm not even sure that many of them have any idea why the name Khorasan was chosen. I mean, I think they probably, if I remember correctly, what they were telling us in the first interviews because of it's an historical name. But as I said, these were essentially people who joined because it was a job opportunity, right? So there were people who wanted to do something. So it's not mercenaries. It's like, you know, all of us have a job. We get paid, right? So we don't see ourselves as mercenaries because we get a salary. So they wanted to do something. They wanted to fight the jihad, but didn't care very much the ideology. They just don't want peace, right? Because peace is the end. If you, the only thing you can do in your life is fighting. You know, you're done fighting all your life. Peace is a threat for you. So that was, I think, the mindset. They were not very sophisticated. You know, it changed a bit later when, you know, they started recruiting universities. But for the first, I would say, 3 years, they were not recruiting. It was actually unwittingly the previous Afghan government that helped them a lot, because in order to reduce or avoid the Taliban gaining influence in the universities, they appointed a lot of Salafis in the Islamic law faculty as professors. Because the idea was the Salafis don't like the Taliban, so we appoint Salafis so they will not support the Taliban. Yes, but then these people brought in or even directly recruited for the Islamic State, and they basically allowed the Islamic State to establish itself in the campuses. So until then, I would say intellectually, it was really, I mean, they didn't have much of a propaganda at all in the first few years. You couldn't get no publications, because social media had not exploded in those years they have now, right? But even in terms of publication, the Taliban themselves are not an intellectual movement. You know, they haven't produced much compelling literature. But in the first few years, the Taliban looked like very intellectual compared to the Islamic State. These are essentially fighters. people knew how to fight, wanted to fight. It took a few years for them to start producing propaganda. It was 2019-20 when militarily things started going very badly for them. And then propaganda started becoming more and more produced on a large scale. And for what we know, most of these people who produce it are not in Afghanistan. For obvious reason that it's not the perfect place to do this. Are in Europe, many are in Europe, over in Turkey, in the Gulf, in Dubai, but they're all somewhere else. So it's actually, I forgot to ask the question about social media skills. That's definitely valued, but again, one of the main job description for people who join in Europe is social media skills. So they use them, European members, some people, for European, I mean, based in Europe, they use them mostly for social media activities, because the Taliban has some ability to track people down. So if you're in Afghanistan and they catch you, that's it. There's no going back. You never get out of prison if you survive. In Europe, first of all, it's easy to disguise yourself because there's so much internet activity. But even if you get caught, okay, you get 1 year, 2 years, right? You don't get 50 years for doing some social media activity. So it's much less dangerous. And also that these people in Europe, what do you do with them? They are not people who can do a terrorist attack. They don't have the mindset, they don't have the capacity. Let them do something useful so we can do fundraising and social media activity. So that's what they do. So I think even compared to, you know that in the Arab world, they have more of an intellectual dimension. There are several scholars that have been producing material for them. Khorasan is not like that. I think if you look, the governor was studying engineering, so he's not even a graduate in Islamic law. The majority of the 𝐊𝐶 supported them are either dead because the Taliban killed them, or disappeared, so basically hiding somewhere. Many of the Salafi 𝐊𝐶, especially in Pakistan, have distanced themselves. So there's not much, I think it's not intellectually sophisticated. I think they don't, even the propaganda mostly is translation from the original Islamic State stuff, of course, unless it's something specific about the events of the day, So it is a commentary on the operations, things that Taliban do to discredit them, or translations, which again I realized that intellectually they're not really the powers of understanding.
Thank you very much. Maybe other questions from the audience?
Sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you. I realized I forgot to present you, Amélie, because you're a member of the QIM ERTI, doctor in sociology, associate member of the 𝐀𝐧𝐭𝐨𝐳𝐳𝐢, le Centre d'analyse et d'intervention sociologique, and writer of several books, among which very recently published Le Coran de sang, le blasphème de Saddam this year. But we also have a question from Guillaume Beau, who is a PhD candidate at Sciences Po Série, currently writing his PhD on a comparison of the state and high civil servants in the Islamic Republic of Iran and Pakistan. And so,
I just have a quick question on the relationship between the Pakistanis and the Taliban as regards to the organization, both in terms of direct intervention, whether there is, any kind of providing intelligence to the Taliban and how to counter the ISIS Khorasan, but also indirectly in terms of tackling recruitment at the madrasa level in KP and Waziristan, for instance. So I don't know to what extent is there any type of cooperation between the Pakistani army, the ISI in particular, and the Taliban in terms of fighting back, or whether the Pakistan factor is actually secondary to the issue, as you maybe just mentioned that Salafi clerics, senior ones at least, have distanced themselves from the organization. So I don't know to what extent this is actually an issue, the Pakistan side of the affair.
thank you very much, Guillaume. And then we'll take a question from the audience. And so
should I answer?
Now,
So, right now the relationship between Pakistan and Taliban is very poor. Even recently they actually welcomed Ahmad Massoud and others, encouraging them to set up camp in Pakistan to do operation against the Taliban. I doubt this can be very successful, but they're trying to signal to the Taliban they're very pissed off with them. There have been a number of border clashes and, of course, the expulsion of illegal Afghan residents from Pakistan. It's very tense. I mean, there's still some Taliban leaders who have relations with Pakistan because they have business interests there. But overall, the relation is very bad. And of course, in Pakistan, you have Khorasan that operates in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. They essentially occasionally clash with the Pakistani armed forces, but mostly what they do is logistics, or they use their safe haven. When the Taliban do operations, they escape, and then they go back to Afghanistan. But they have a logistical structure that probably is, I estimate, around 600 people would do procurement, basically, because, of course, like in Peshawar, you can buy things to send over the border, including, of course, in Pakistan, buying weapons, ammunition is very easy because, it's everywhere. So they do that. And then you have, of course, Pakistan province. And Pakistan province is a very controversial issue, even within the Islamic State, because for a long time, Khorasan accused Pakistan province of having been infiltrated by the ISI. And there is some truth, because recently, in recent months, they've executed several of their members on allegation of basically working for Pakistani intelligence. So, when you start executing tens of your members, it's a serious thing, it's not like just gossip. And I think that apparently has happened also with Khorasan. So there were, which is not unusual for the Pakistani security forces, they tried to co-opt or essentially buy some commanders from the two branches of the Islamic State, Khorasan and Pakistan, for their own purposes. So essentially they're trying to use them against the Taliban or to control Khorasan. Basically have somebody within the organization to report to you or whatever. And this has created, of course, really knowing what the truth is problematic, but we know that there have been at least 2 meetings online with senior people from the Caliphate over this, because the allegation reached the Caliphate, and the Caliphate is very worried that Khorasan and Pakistan would be infiltrated by the Pakistani authorities. So there was a bit of a turmoil, and also they knew about the rivalry between these 2 provinces, and they ordered Pakistan province to support Khorasan. So there have been a number of issues, but overall I think there's no cooperation for sure between Pakistan and Taliban over the Islamic State. So you may believe or not that Pakistan tried, the Taliban alleges, that Pakistan is using Khorasan as a tool of pressure against them. I think it's exaggerated, but definitely don't cooperate against it. And even Khorasan, they acknowledge that they can still recruit in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in the madrasas, whereas the Taliban have closed all the Salafi, almost all the Salafi madrasas. They're still open in Pakistan, not only open, but recruitment seems to be going on without hindrance. So there is no, and if you talk to both Khorasan and Pakistan province, and you ask them, usually they're very proud of the sacrifices they make for the cause. And you ask them how many people, how many martyrs you had in Pakistan, the numbers are very low. So there is very little effort from Pakistan to really crack down on them militarily. I think that strategy is more infiltration rather than, fighting or detaining or trying, So for sure, Khorasan is able, relatively easy without impediment, to move many hundreds of people from Afghanistan to Pakistan whenever they want. And there are places in Tira Valley, for example, where they seem to be able to go without anybody. Of course, it's a very remote part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but anyway, they're able to go there and then seem to, now is 8 years, right? So 8-9 years, nothing happening suggests that there is perhaps a degree of tolerance. They'd rather not deal with the problem. I don't think it's just by chance. So basically, that's the answer. Yeah.
Thank you. D'autres questions? Il y a eu madame.
I have 2 questions, a fairly easy one, and another one maybe a bit more far-fetched. The first one is where the control areas, did they establish religious court, and if so, which legal school do they refer to for their judgments? And the second one is, do they have any kind of relationship with some of the more conservative Sufi movements that may be going on in this area?
Start from the end. So the relation with the Sufis is very, very bad. Afghanistan Sufis, although there are different types of Sufis, but the more conservative Sufis are very much aligned with the Taliban. And actually this bad relation between the Salafis and the Sufis is one of the reasons why many Salafis joined the Islamic State. Because when the Taliban strengthened their presence in Kunar around 2014-15, about the same time when the Islamic State appeared in Khorasan, that had a very negative repercussion because the Taliban were essentially Hanafi or Sufis or both. And most of the population is Salafi. And there was a lot of friction, a lot of tension, even abuses by the Taliban or armed clashes. And that gradually pushed many Salafis on the east to join the Islamic State, essentially for self-defense. So we have evidence, people told us, confessed to us that many elders, community elders, and many the ulema, Salafi ulema of the east, encouraged villages, entire villages, basically, to join the Islamic State, as basically to form militias to fight on the Islamic State side against the Taliban, to protect, the idea was to protect the Salafi community from extinction, because the Taliban started, especially more recently when the Taliban started closing down or taking over mosques and madrasas. So many madrasas have been reopened, now have principals who are Hanafis and Taliban. And the mosques are banned from preaching Salafi Islam, essentially. So that creates a lot of tension. And in terms of the judiciary, there is something. The problem is that we couldn't find a single person who ever been in an Islamic State court. So in principle, there is one in Kunar, but we cannot find anybody who has ever attended. Maybe they don't want to talk about it. Maybe they are afraid of saying, I've been in one of these courts, so it's difficult to gather information about it. But one important point, of course, Salafis means different things to different people. Wherever you go, you will hear different definition of Salafis. In Pakistan, there is a certain idea of Salafis that basically they have different groups of Salafis. Like Panjpiris are seen by some people as Salafis, but scholars in the West tend to see the Panjpiris as a kind of hybrid Deobandi, whatever. So there are different schools. The Ali Sunnah is seen as separate from other. So it's. But in Afghanistan, if you tell them, but do you see different schools of Salafis? They really get very angry. They deny that there could be potentially any kind of difference. But the reality is that the Salafis in Afghanistan, from the point of view of jurisprudence, they are Hanafis. They don't have a separate jurisprudence. As I said, these are essentially mostly village people with a few ulema, and the ulema are mostly dead, right? So who's gonna develop a separate Salafi jurisprudence? Is not, there's no authority to do that. So in practical terms, I'm not sure what the courts do, on which basis they rule, but I would imagine they would rule on some kind of bastard Hanafi law, maybe with some elements taken from Salafis, but most of the things they would rule about, you wouldn't see practical differences, between Salafis and Hanafis. So, but the reality is that people won't talk about it. If they do use this course, they don't want to admit they do.
D'autres questions? Oui, monsieur.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Giustozzi, for the presentation. My name is Ternici. I'm a PhD researcher at Institut Catholique de Paris at Sciences Po Vernon. I just come back from 1 month in Pakistan. And I have 3 questions. The first one is about the recruiting process in universities. If you can go deep on that subject, which universities, if there are cases of collusions between some professors from administration administrators of these universities, if they are only in Afghanistan or maybe also in Pakistan. And the other two questions, the first one is about, you said that right now the elite of the terrorist forces, they come from Central Asia. Can you explain a little bit more about that? And the third one is about Turkey. You said this country came a lot of times during your presentation. Is there some cities, some regions in Turkey in which ISIS-K fighters are located? Which was the role? You said that there was a sort of period between, in a sort of time in which the Turkish forces, they had time to realize what was going on in their country. So which is the role of Turkey? There are some cities which are more concerned about that. Thank you.
Right, so on the recruiting universities, at one point, most of the recruitment, so when they started, was in Jalalabad University, which is in part because a lot of students, they are Salafis, for the obvious reason that much of the population is Salafi. So in Jalalabad, you would have students coming a bit from everywhere, but mostly, of course, from Nangarhar province, but also from the east. So many are Salafis. And you had very strong, essentially the campus was controlled by this student union called Jamaat Islam, which was largely Salafi leaning, so it was an ideal place basically for the Islamic State to recruit there. But knowing that the Taliban have clamped down very heavily, they asserted control very firmly in Jalalabad. The one advantage they have that they themselves have a lot of supporters in Jalalabad and in the campus, so easy to recruit informers. So basically now if you are an Islamic State recruiter and you go around, inviting people, trying, hey, look, you end up in jail very quickly because the Taliban have a very thick network of informers there. But in other places, like Kabul was the second most important place in terms of recruitment. In Kabul, it's much harder for the Taliban because most Kabulis don't like the Taliban, and most students in Kabul are even less likely to like the Taliban. They're mostly Tajiks, and in general, Tajiks and Afghans have a lot of issues with the Taliban. So it's much harder for the Taliban to establish a very thick network of informers because there would be most of the body of students there will not be sympathetic at all. So if you don't have sympathizers, then it's difficult to recruit informers. On the teachers, essentially it was the case that some of the relatively senior ulema that the Ghana administration in Afghanistan appointed as professors in the Islamic law faculty were actually arrested under the Ghana administration for recruiting or supporting the Islamic State. They were put in jail. The Taliban themselves then killed some of these. Some are still in detention and some escaped and they're hiding somewhere. We don't know where they are. So now we hear that there are still some teachers who support the Islamic State, but anyway, they have to be very careful. So it's very difficult. They won't even give us a name because, of course, there could be too much of a risk for an individual in that position because the Taliban are not tender with these people, right? So it's almost a death sentence, or at least, a very long prison sentence. So sentence being reduced in terms of, the capability, the ability of professors and teachers, to do something. And that's why I said, now they've shifted much of the effort online. Before it was hybrid, face-to-face and online. Now it seems to be largely online, but they also recruit in other universities. In Faisalabad, in the northeast, there's a pedagogic institute where Hizb traditionally was strong, so they seem to be recruiting there. There's a private university was founded by the old comrades of Ahmad Massoud and basically the Muslim brothers, the Muslim brothers of the previous generation who fought in the 80s, founded at some point this private university on the border between the province of Parwan and Kapisa, which is a bit ideological, but the ideology would be more like Muslim Brotherhood type. But again, there is a bit of overlap with the Islamic State, and they said, Islamic State in Khorasan is not particularly pure ideologically, so apparently they recruit there by their own admission, and some people been detained as well. They recruited a little bit in Madar Sharif, again, Tajiks. But I would say in terms of numbers, were definitely Kabul and Jalalabad, and Jalalabad largely gone. They tried to do it in the rest of the Pashtun belt in the south. They don't seem to have a lot of success there. The Taliban are much more popular in the south and in the east, so I think it's much more difficult. With regard to the elite, what I meant is that if you look at the failed and successful terrorist attacks of the Islamic State in the last few years, is largely Central Asians. And the reason is that, as I mentioned, perhaps the use of the term elite is not fully appropriate because they're not particularly well trained, as we see by the high rate of failure. But what I mean is that they are the ones who essentially are tasked with doing what amount to kamikaze attack, because essentially either you die or get captured. It's almost impossible to come back from this kind of operation. So the reason I think is that on the one hand, they're not needed, so they don't have huge human resources left, so they are careful. They're not going to send a very committed Syrian Kurd to blow himself up, because they need them to secure whatever is left of the Islamic State in Syria. They are in a very difficult position. Everybody's against them. The Assad regime, the Russians, the Americans. Tell me of a place where Americans and Russians now agree on something. That's Syria. But not only that, even Al-Qaeda is against them, and also Ayatollah Shah. So basically, in the Turkish militias. So I mean, it's not really a good place for them to be. And therefore, if they have any committed Kurd, they need them to survive. The same for Iraq. It's a very difficult situation. So they're not going to throw these people on operation where the success rate is 3%, right? You had better keep these ones there. But the Central Asians who have no use in Syria, no use in Iraq, and right now really no use in Central Asia either. So what do? You use them for these terrorist attacks. They have some expertise. They know how to use weapons because they fought there as a regular army, of the caliphate for years. So they know what a Kalashnikov is. They know what a hand grenade is. They have some idea of explosive. Yeah, they're not, the reality is that if you want to do a really professional terrorist attack that Khan Act was doing in Kabul, you need to start training people when they are 6. The Afghanis had 2 madrasas were essentially using to produce suicide bombers. Of course, they would indoctrinate children. 80% of them would fail the course, would be sent to do something else. But those who graduated were willing to die for the cause and not to ask any question. But it takes many years to produce a kind of mindset where somebody can do a suicide attack efficiently. Because they can do it, you can be efficient. But do the 2 things together and be efficient when you're going to die is very difficult to create the kind of mindset, right? So it's not something you can improvise. It's not something that all of a sudden you can say, okay, let's do it. No, you can't do it. So they use what they have, and these are the Central Asians. It's not very effective, as we have seen, but they still do it, and will keep doing it, because I think there's still a few hundred of Central Asians that are potentially willing to do this kind of attacks. And the good thing about Europe, that if you get caught, okay, you end up in prison, but at least you survive. Being in a European prison maybe is not so much worse than the Syrian desert, actually. It can appeal to some of these people. And then Turkey. So the reality is that Turkey, during the Syrian civil war, saw the Islamic State a useful tool, among many other tools, to put as much pressure on the other side, especially when they realized that the groups they are supporting on their own would not win. Okay, so then first it was Al-Qaeda that started getting supported, then Islamic State, simply because the people that the Turks favored on their own, they clearly couldn't do it. And of course, even the other couldn't do it, but anyway, they didn't know that time. So they were willing, and of course, there have been even people in Turkey will tell you, that centrally logistics for the Islamic State was coming through undeterred. There was this famous case where the gendarmerie stopped deliveries to the Islamic State, and he ended up with the Islamic State couriers being released, and the gendarmerie would be put in prison by the intelligence, right? So, these things have been happening. People have construed this as to say that Turkey and the Islamic State, were in cahoots. I think it was opportunistic because they thought, anyway, these guys for now are useful because they're putting pressure on Assad. They need them, otherwise the war is lost. And Erdogan invested a lot in that war, right? And he didn't want it to go to rot. So that changed, first because, of course, the war in Syria anyway was lost. So once you know that, you don't need Islamic State anymore because it's not your favorite partner. Nobody would say we really like working with the Islamic State. And on the other hand, they discovered, and they probably realized even before they started turning against the Islamic State, that the Islamic State was actually putting roots in Turkey. There were Central Turkish fighters in Syria, and that was more or less visible, but they realized they were building a large infrastructure inside Turkey, okay? There were actually some terrorist attacks in Turkey, on and off, and I think it was the Islamic State warning the Turks, we want more, give us more space, otherwise we become angry. And it happened in other countries as well, so it's not something peculiar to Turkey. And I think, the Turks at one point decided, okay, these guys are totally unreliable. Certainly, they are not thankful for what they got, and they're very dangerous. So let's finish them off. And of course, what they did, the Turks are not stupid, they kept track of them. Even when they were supporting them, letting the logistics through and whatever, they didn't just forget who was involved. The intelligence was active. They collated a lot of information about all the networks, all the individuals, the safe houses. So when they cracked down, all of a sudden they started arresting a lot of people, discovering a lot of safe houses. It's obvious they've been accumulating intelligence for quite some time. So now I think the Turks are really trying to dismantle them because they don't see any use for them. It's only danger. Plus, once you start, stopping is difficult, right? Because are you going to explain that you suddenly stop this big crackdown on the Islamic State? So I think this is also understood by the Islamic State. This is my point. The Islamic State knows that soon, soon means in this case probably a couple of years, they will be wiped out. The Turks are very serious. When the Turkish intelligence decides to do something, it's not like, the intelligence of Honduras. They are, they have quite a grip on things, their capabilities, they're ruthless, they have resources, so, and the Islamic State knows them very well. So they're doomed, basically. They can't just sit and wait, hoping maybe they forget about us, maybe they get away, because they can see that the more people they detain, the more people will share information with the Turkish intelligence, even more people will be detained, even more safe houses, even more flats full of cash will be seized. So I think it's obvious. I think it's clear that they at most have a couple of years before it's all dismantled. So I think they made a decision, whatever we have, let's use it now for a relaunch before we lose all of it. I think it's a rational decision from their point of view.
Well, thank you very much, Antonio, for this masterful presentation with very granular, lot of information, details, perspectives, and we are very thankful and grateful for your presence here. Merci beaucoup aussi à Pierre et au Grand Continent et à l'excellence du public et des étudiants également très knowledgeable sur le sujet. Merci beaucoup pour votre participation.